In this lesson, we're going to focus on modern agriculture. So in the previous lesson, we looked at the origins of agriculture. I like to spend a little bit of time in class thinking about the agricultural system of today, and more specifically, the agricultural system of the United States today. So right off the bat, we'll spend some time comparing and contrasting an industrialized agricultural system with your concept of a traditional agricultural system. Noting that when I say traditional, I don't necessarily mean a sustainable agricultural system. That's a whole different story, isn't it? We'll talk about that. And we'll also spend some time looking at the roots of our modern or industrialized agricultural system. And we'll mostly talk about the Green Revolution, and a little bit of time will be spent on genetic modification of plants. We will look at this more, the genetic modification of plants, next week, but I did want to kind of mention it now. For one, because we'll be going to the Wisconsin Crop Innovation Center next week, and you'll be seeing a lot of plant tissue culture, and because often when we talk about industrialized agriculture, issues regarding genetic modification inevitably come up. So I like to talk about that just a little bit in this lesson, but we'll have much more in-depth introduction to that side of agriculture next week. Before we go on in the lesson, I want you to do your own compare and contrast of an industrialized agricultural system and a traditional agricultural system. Make a list. What do you think of when you think of a traditional farm, a traditional ag system, versus our modern commercial agricultural system? And then in our next slide, we'll talk about this in more depth. We'll also look at how the Green Revolution was actually kind of the root of our modern agricultural system and what that means, what the cost of our modern agricultural system has been. The tables here probably include a lot of the things you've already thought about. So traditional agricultural system being smaller, more of the mom and pop, probably using more of the traditional practice of crop rotation, probably greater diversity. If you're thinking of a traditional agricultural system, probably more space for some pros of a traditional agricultural system would include keeping more space open for natural resources and for wildlife, because we're not growing in as much area. Probably a lot more labor intensive, but a pro to that would be that it employs a lot more people. There are some cons to the traditional agricultural system. Probably don't grow as much food. Farmers tend not to make a lot of money, and it actually has a very heavy pollution. There's a lot of different ways that pollution can occur in a traditional ag system that we are actually reducing using our modern system. So there's some interesting compares and contrasts in the pros and cons that people often don't expect, and we'll talk about that. So with the modern agricultural system, we generally think of much more acreage. So we'll grow a lot of acres and generally the same crop, so a lot less biodiversity in our modern agricultural system. That's the word monoculture. Extensive use of fertilizers, extensive use of pesticides. I would actually say we are in some ways transitioning away from that, and we'll talk about that when we talk about genetically modified crops. There's some literature to suggest that with some of the genetically modified crops, we're actually increasing the biodiversity of the region around where those crops are grown, because in a more traditional high production setting, we would have used a lot of the herbicides or pesticides that with some of our GMO crops we can reduce the use of. There's controversy over that, though. There's also, with our modern agricultural system, a lot of different government subsidy programs, particularly, of course, in the United States. And that's good for farmers in some ways, because farmers that are growing a lot of acreage can make a substantial amount of money growing particular crops. But it's also very, very difficult to navigate. And if you're not growing the crops that are subsidized, you certainly aren't making the same kind of money. And then we select crops very differently. So now in our modern agricultural system, crops are produced very often. A primary reason a crop is produced is for animal production or for animal feed or for some other processing or process. Maybe when we grow soybeans, we don't just grow them for something that people are going to directly eat. We are growing it for soy meals and for products that are, even paint has a soy product that is used in it. So all different kinds of things. And that's good because our crops are used in a lot of different ways, but it also leads us to have a kind of a negative impact in our diet and our health. So there's some interesting contrasts. Often we romanticize the idea of a traditional agricultural system. We see it as better. But there are some significant cons to the traditional agricultural system and some major benefits in our modern agricultural system, of course, with some drawbacks as well. But it's important for us to have a more objective perspective when we're thinking about agriculture and think about how do we move towards a sustainable agricultural system. Going back to the traditional ways is certainly not going to be sustainable. We're not going to be able to produce enough, and it really wasn't that great for the environment. So what does a sustainable agricultural system look like is something we want to be thinking about as well. But first, let's think about how we got to the agricultural system that we have today. So there's no question that there's been a major transformation over the last 100 years or so in our agricultural system. And a lot of that had to do with industrialization. In fact, post-World War I and World War II were both responsible for significantly transforming our agricultural system. Part of this had to do with the Green Revolution, with modern advances in plant breeding and plant biotechnology, and we'll talk about all those things. But before we go too far, I wanted to point out that I think sometimes there's some misconception about the modern agricultural system. For one, we think of the modern agricultural system as a gigantic corporate monoculture. And in fact, the majority of farms in the United States are actually family-owned farms. In fact, almost 97% of farms in the United States are family-owned farms. And approximately 90% of all the produce produced by farms is sold by these family-owned farms. That's not to say that the average size of the farm has not significantly increased. So since about the 1970s, the average acreage of the farm has increased by about 50 acres. So today the average acreage of a farm, and this is highly variable, so this number doesn't hold a great deal of meaning, but average acreage is about 434. So 434 acres on a farm. Just to give you an idea of an acre, it's about the size of a football field. But, and we've also lost a lot of farms in the last 30, 40 years. There's been about 500 million farms that have either gone under or been consolidated, et cetera, et cetera. But we still have lots and lots and lots, thousands and thousands and thousands of farms. And there's an interesting dynamic in the farming community now. In fact, we've seen a significant increase in small farm holders in the last 15 years. So there's some really exciting times in agriculture, both for the large, gigantic farming that's going on and for the small family farm. And I posted a really great article, I think, from the Washington Post. It's just an optional read, but I think it helps us sort of sift through some of the paradigm that we have for family farm. What does that word actually mean, and what does farming really look like? Now, this isn't to say that there's not some significant problems with our industrialized agricultural system, and we'll discuss some of that in this lecture. Agricultural practices across the world really started to change after World War II. This was in part due to just a demand for food. The population was booming across the globe, and there was millions and millions of people starving. So there was a massive demand for food. But there had also been work done during the entire course of both World War I and World War II, developing new chemicals and production strategies that could revolutionize the way food was grown. So a lot of times we use this term green revolution as kind of a catch-all phrase for global agricultural overhaul. But more specifically, the Green Revolution has to do with wheat production, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide. Essentially, there was new strategies for breeding crops to increase their yield. There was also a lot of mechanization and efficiency systems, that much of which was taken from the prior wars. So all of the chemistry knowledge, all of the engineering knowledge, a lot of that could now be applied to agricultural systems. And later in the kind of shift in our agricultural system, there was a bunch of new government subsidy programs. So up until about the 1970s, farmers were actually subsidized to grow a particular amount of food or a particular acreage. So they were actually subsidized not to grow food in some cases, as weird as that sounds. After the 1970s, subsidy programs were massively overhauled, and farmers were subsidized to grow more. So the more crop a farmer grew, the more money the farmer would make. There's a movie called King Corn that does an amazing job of really showing the shift in government subsidy programs and how that shifted our agricultural systems. And so I highly recommend that to you. It's actually free on Netflix if that's an interesting topic to you. King Corn was the name of that movie. But we'll talk more about the specifics of the Green Revolution in our next slides. So that's a picture of Dr. Norman Borlaug. Dr. Borlaug was a scientist at University of Minnesota. He was actually a plant breeder and a plant pathologist. And he was a very sincere and interesting scientist, and he had a sincere desire to improve the lives of people. He felt that plant pathology was a wonderful field because one person could change the world. And that's kind of an exciting thing to think about. As a plant pathologist, you could literally save millions and millions and millions of people from starvation with his knowledge. And that's exactly what he did. So working off the basis of scientists that had come before him, starting as early as the 1920s and 1930s, Dr. Borlaug developed new wheat varieties. And these wheat varieties had much larger seed heads, so they had a much greater yield. And he also made shorter, stockier versions of these high-yielding wheat varieties. So it wasn't just a fact that they had, larger grain heads. They were shorter and stockier, which was really important because if they weren't shorter and stockier, they would have all fallen over because they were so top-heavy. So it was kind of this double whammy of having much larger grain heads, being short and stocky. The problem with his work, it was very, very useful. It produced massive amounts of grain. In fact, in the 1950s, before these new wheat varieties were produced, the United States actually imported half of their wheat. So even the U.S., where we think about we have more than enough food, right? Even in the United States, we did not grow enough wheat to serve the population of the U.S. in the 1950s. We had to import half of our wheat. But now we export wheat. We grow so much wheat. So these were profoundly impactful outcomes. He's probably responsible for saving billions of people's lives, and he won the Nobel Prize for his work. However, the wheat that he produced, he and of course many other scientists produced, was also much more demanding in terms of production needs. So it required all of that mechanization we talked about in the previous slide. It also required a lot more water and a lot of fertilizers. So this was wheat that was very responsive to fertilizers. So think about the environmental costs. So we're talking about all this water, all these fertilizers, more land, more mechanization. And Dr. Borlaug is very well known for going into parts of the globe that had people starving and introducing these new wheat varieties. And then, of course, now people have food. But that wasn't a very sustainable system because without all that mechanization, without all the access to water and the chemical fertilizers, we certainly aren't going to be able to continue to grow wheat at that high yield for very long. In fact, the consequence could be that you've damaged the environment so badly that we can't grow anything there after that wheat production has taken place. So there's kind of a double-edged sword when we talk about the specifics of the Green Revolution. And I put this slide in here just to remind you that Dr. Borlaug's work was all traditional plant breeding. So we're not talking genetically modified organisms here. He was using traditional breeding practices, just like you're doing for your Crop of the Future project. And through those traditional breeding practices, although they may take much longer, we can incorporate disease resistance, change size, taste, all kinds of other parameters. So these were traditional breeding practices, not genetically modified organisms. And in the post below my voiceover here, I've included some additional links for you so you can read more about Green Revolution. And of course, your textbook chapter is very thorough as well. And I think the term is used differently in different places. In some places, you'll hear it referred to, Green Revolution is specifically Dr. Norman Borlaug's work and then the consequences of that work. In other places, you'll read it starting as early as the 1920s, and then Dr. Borlaug is kind of the spokesperson for Green Revolution. So it kind of depends on the context that you're looking at it. And today's lecture, we're really thinking about it in terms of how the consequences of Green Revolution have shifted our modern agricultural practices and what that means, and the good, the bad, and how do we move towards a sustainable agricultural system. And there is no doubt that there were significant gains in yield and many, many benefits to the people of the world through the Green Revolution. So if you look on the next slide, which I won't do a voiceover for, you can just look at the graph on your own, you can see that the number of undernourished people in developing countries declined massively. Total food production increased significantly. So check out the graph. You can see from the 1960s to the 2000s, we have significant decrease in the number of hungry people and significant increases in food production, and also significant decreases in food prices. So there was some incredible benefits to the planet, to the world population due to the Green Revolution. But there were also some very serious consequences. This was not a sustainable agricultural system. And we'll talk about that in the next slides. The significant increases that we saw in crop production actually came at a heavy cost to the environment. The high-yielding varieties were extremely demanding of water, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. The high throughput or the high scale of the production required lots of maintenance, planting, significant amounts of heavy equipment and mechanization that these developing parts of the world often did not have. And the crops that we tend to grow are far less genetically diverse and generally a lot more susceptible to environmental disease and other threats. So there is a real concern about the long-term sustainability of the model that was developed during the Green Revolution period. Since this shift in our agricultural practices, we see an unsustainable increase in dam development, and we know that dams damage the environment. I'll provide some links for you to support this fact in your folder on Blackboard. We also see a much higher and unsustainable consumption of water for agriculture. So look at the drought in California. Much of our agriculture occurs in California or in parts of the world that require irrigation. California actually accounts for 65% of agricultural irrigation water we use. And that's because we are irrigating the desert to grow food. This is simply not a sustainable practice. And we will see some in the future, some probably wars start over this water consumption. And we also see a shift from traditional crop production practice that includes animals. So in those traditional practices where you'd grow food and animals, you'd grow food crops and animals, you could actually use the animal waste as fertilizers. So now we have the development of crops that are dependent upon heavy fertilization, and therefore we have a significant increase in fertilizer application. And this has an incredibly bad effect on our water quality. And again, I'll post some links for you for this as well. There are some strategies that farmers can employ to help reduce the effects of the fertilizer on our water quality. But interestingly, even though there are best practices in place, it's amazing how often I see farmers not employing these best practices. So there's things that could be done even with our modern agricultural system that are fairly simple that could improve things. But as you can see from this, we have a major sustainability issue with our modern agricultural system. In addition to the environmental damage that dams can cause and the problems associated with heavy water consumption in areas of the country like California, where we get a lot of our agricultural products from, we also have a significant problem with herbicides in our surface and groundwater. So the herbicide application for our modern agricultural system doesn't just go away. And you can see in this map that significant portions of the United States have high levels of herbicide in their water supplies. And this is a problem that we actually don't discuss it very much, but it is a very big problem. And it is the direct result of our modern agricultural system. Volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, are contained in a wide variety of commercial, industrial, residential products, including fuels, gas, any solvents or cleaners, degreasers, ink, refrigerants, and pesticides. So in agriculture, often it will be the fumigant type pesticides that can contribute significantly to VOCs in drinking water. Now, before I go too much further, I also want to point out that even the peel of an orange contains a volatile organic compound. So essential oils from plants are actually considered volatile organic compounds. But I don't want to dismiss volatile organic compounds as a non-issue. They are actually a significant issue, and we're exposed to them fairly regularly in the air, in our food. We can be contacted through our skin, and sometimes in our drinking water supply. And I actually bring this up because in Wisconsin, you can see this map, we have some areas that have some fairly high levels of volatile organic compounds in our drinking water. They can be harmless, they might not be a big deal, like the orange peel that I mentioned, or they can be carcinogenic. So the Environmental Protection Agency estimates that volatile organic chemicals are present in about a fifth of our water supply. In Minnesota, they say about 6% of the public water supplies have volatile organic compounds, and in Wisconsin, we say that about 4% total of our water contains detectable levels of volatile organic compounds. And lead is not a volatile organic compound. That's a completely different cause of lead poisoning in our water. But if you are following at all the issue with Flint, Michigan and lead in the water, you may know that sometimes the public agencies that are responsible for water quality, water testing, aren't exactly forthcoming on the quality of our water. So I think it's actually something that, as a public, we should become more comfortable discussing, more familiar with, and better equipped to kind of know what quality of water and what are the issues that the water that we're consuming we might be exposed to from that. So this is another reason I bring up volatile organics. because it's something that's a larger issue than just agriculture, but the fact that a lot of these volatile organic compounds actually originated due to agricultural production practices. And that's actually another thing that we could eliminate fairly easily from modern agricultural practice and not have it be a contributing factor. I think this slide kind of speaks for itself. The health effects of pesticides can be serious, and from my own experience working in agriculture, I think we have often been too cavalier about the use and application of pesticides. However, I do also believe that some aspects of modern agriculture have reduced our exposure to pesticides, and we'll discuss more of that next week when we talk about plant biotech. But the very last slide in my slideshow here shows a positive result of genetic modification that has reduced the exposure of the environment to different types of herbicides and pesticides. In some ways, modern agricultural production and ag production as a whole kind of has some ethical questions associated with it. We can probably all agree that the modern agricultural system is deeply flawed, but we can also agree that modern production strategies do result in very significant increases in food production. So the ethical question to consider is who gets to decide how we grow our food? We know through the Green Revolution we have prevented the starvation of millions of people, that life expectancy increased by at least 10 years over the course of the Green Revolution, that resulted in a higher standard of living for many, many, many people. And right now, we are able to produce far more food than the world actually needs. Now, an aside, food production is not the same thing as food distribution. That's a completely different story. But we actually, at least, can produce enough food. The distribution is another story. So I think this leads us to the next wave in agriculture. And it's really timely because we're going to be going to the biotech facility next week. And I think there's some interesting questions that you can be thinking about. Is the work of the biotech industry increasing or decreasing dependence on pesticide? Is the work of the biotech industry and plant agriculture as a whole moving us towards a more sustainable future through these technologies? So when people are scared of plant biotech, often it's just they're afraid of the unknown, but they're not asking the right questions. They're not asking what can we use this technology to actually do to benefit the rest of the world or to benefit us. And just a final note here that I think is especially timely because we'll be going to the Wisconsin Crop Innovation Center on Monday. I wanted to mention that most of the current agriculturally based problems are not due to the production of genetically modified crops. For example, the study that I have here is an 18-year study conducted in China, and this was published in Science and Nature. These researchers discovered that by growing Bt cotton, and this is a cotton that produces its own pesticide in the form of a very specific toxin, they found that there was significant reduction in pesticide application and, most importantly, a very significant increase in the biodiversity of the region. So when we're thinking modern agriculture, often I think people think two things. They think giant corporate agriculture that uses genetically modified crops. And while there is some truth to this paradigm that they have in their head regarding modern agriculture, it's certainly not the whole truth. And we'll keep talking about this next week when we start talking about plant biotech in more depth.